Sunday morning, and the reason being, it's hard for me to step into someone else's class, so I thought I would just leave Tony's material, and he can go through that next, pick up where he left off next Wednesday, Lord willing. For those of you who may not have been in our class, the elders asked me, I don't know, at least a month ago, perhaps more, to give a series of lessons for basically new converts. And I entitled the series, Now That I'm a Christian, Where Do I Go From Here? What's next? What's now? And we've already looked at several things. I'll just kind of give you the headings of what we have discussed thus far. We talked about possessing a desire to grow in knowledge and how important it was to study. We talked about attendance, and we began talking, I guess it was at least last week, the whole class period, maybe even before that, concerning authority. But I think it's important as a new convert, we need to understand that I must have authority for everything I say and do religiously. And we looked at an account from the Old Testament, which I think is very foretelling, about David moving the ark. And of course, how Uzzah, the ark stumbled, he put his hand forward, touched the ark, and God slew him. And we talked about why. And David learned the lesson because we didn't do it, we didn't follow God's pattern, we didn't follow his plan. We didn't do it, in his words, after the due order of things. And we saw how important that it was to have authority for that which we do religiously. And I made mention last week, just to kind of summarize, that David was just beginning his leadership as king. And I think that was a major lesson that God taught him. Listen, religiously, you must follow the pattern. The things that God had told Moses to do. They were living under the Mosaic law. And David wasn't above that, even though he was king. And I think that was the first example that had to have a major impact in his life. We want to conclude that particular topic this evening, but I want to look at God has not given us the liberty to devise our own religious practices. I know that many times new converts, they look to the world, and this world's so messed up religiously. I see so many various things taught, often contradictory. I have a friend who is actually a preacher, and he believes that once you're saved, you're always saved. Nothing you could ever do to lose that salvation. If you're truly saved, and it doesn't matter if you commit adultery, it doesn't matter if you murder, it doesn't matter if you rape, it doesn't matter if you curse God and say, I'm never going to set foot in another place of worship, it doesn't matter. You are a child of God. You've been bought by the blood of Christ. And yet, there's many others, including myself, who don't believe that. And yet, there's other people, because of all the conflicting things, think it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're sincere. Well, let's look at some passages of Scripture here, and I want to show you that God never left us religiously to do what we wanted, to devise our own way of, whether it be worship, morally, or any of those things. Let's turn to the book of Mark, chapter 7, for a moment. Mark, chapter 7, I'm going to read verse 1 through 13. Mark, chapter 7, verse 1 beginning. Then came together unto him the Pharisees, and certain of the scribes, which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. And when they came from the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things there be, which they have received to hold, as the washing of cups and pots and brazen vessels and of tables. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, speaking about Jesus now, asked him, Why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with unwashed hands? All right, before we go further, let's make sure we understand what the issue is. these individuals, the Pharisees from verse 1, they saw the disciples eat before washing their hands. They said, that's not according to tradition. Why, and even said that. Verse 3, except they wash their hands often, they eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. Is that a good tradition? Seriously, what would you say?
Yes.
Sure it is. That's just good hygiene. We typically, and I guess that's why I'm so big, but I'm working out all the time, and I'm going into restaurants, fast food, whatever, whether it be Wendy's or some other place, but I always go to the restroom first, wash my hands. And they said, why did your disciples do that? They're not holding the tradition of the elders. Now, while we would all perhaps agree, maybe that was good hygiene, they were practicing, and I'm not talking about they had this custom. The question is, the issue is, was it a sin? Is it a sin to eat without washing our
I
hands?
don't guess it's a sin.
Pardon?
I don't guess it's a sin.
Well, no. It's not a violation of God in any way. And it is amazing sometimes what people do. I remember years and years ago, we were actually in Alaska. I had friends who had deep pockets, and they drugged me a lot of places hunting that I would never have an opportunity to go. But there was one of the bush guides, interesting characters out there. But anyway, one of the fellows had killed a caribou the day or two before. And of course, those guys, they fill, dress and cut the meat up and so on. And we're out there in the middle of nowhere. And when I call that, I mean, you're literally in the middle. You don't hear a lawnmower in the background. You don't hear noises. It's nothing but maybe a drone of a plane going over. And I'm talking about a float plane or something like that. And it's tough out there on the tundra, walking and stuff like that. But we stopped, we took a break, he took his pack off. He pulled out some cheese, a block of cheese. It looked good. But he took his knife out. He hadn't cleaned that knife blade. He cut that cheese. There was red streaks of dry blood through that cheese where he worked that caribou up the day before, or 2 days before. He said, "You want some?" Boy, I looked at that and I warmed him. I said, "No, thank you." I mean, cleanliness makes a difference. We all agree with that. So that's their beef with Jesus. The disciples, they didn't wash their hands. Now, all right, look what he goes on to say, though, Jesus. And it teaches us a lesson about authority. And he answered and said unto them, Well hath Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites. As it is written, This people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Now let's make sure we comprehend what Jesus is saying. He's rebuking them, and he called them hypocrites. Now we've talked about this numerous times in the class, but it bears repeating the question, what is a hypocrite? What's a hypocrite?
You do one thing.
Say one thing and do it opposite.
Say one thing, do another, pretend. Melissa said you pretend to be something that you're not. Again, I know you're tired of me defining it. I just think it's important for us to keep that in our minds. It comes from a Greek word that has to do with acting. All right? Back in many days prior to today, actors would often hold up little sticks with a mask on. And if I'm playing one character, I hold that maybe in front of my face, and I'm John Doe. And I might even change the tone of my voice or something like that. In the next act, then I hold another mask up, a stick with a mask, and I'm someone else. Okay, I'm acting. I'm pretending to be someone that I'm really not. That's the definition of the word hypocrite. And Jesus says, no, you're hypocrites. Well, how are they hypocrites? All right, Jesus says in verse 7, Howbeit in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. You see, they had bound the washing of hands as something that it is sin if you don't do it. Well, where does the Bible teach that? Now again, we've all agreed, it's a good practice, but God never demanded that we wash our hands before we eat. So here they had made something, a command, and even binding it upon people that God never done. But on the other hand, Jesus is going to say, some places that God has bound, you don't do it. In other words, you've made your own rules and laws spiritually. Okay, let's see this. Verse 8. For laying aside the commandment of God, ye hold the tradition of men, as the washing of plates and cups, and many other such like things ye do. And he said unto them, full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition. And then he gives an example. For Moses said, honor thy father and mother, and whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, if a man shall say to his father or mother, it is Corban, that is to say, a gift. By whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, he shall be free. And you suffer him no more to do aught for his father or his mother, making the word of God of none effect through your tradition, which ye have delivered, and many such like things you do. There was the commandment, the Old Testament, to honor your father and your mother. What Jesus has reference to here, they had come up with an idea, I think it's really to make money. But if you say it's Corban and you bring money to the religious leaders of the day, you are then exempt from taking care of your parents, your aged parents. You no longer have to care for them because you paid Corban. Well, the Old Testament law never taught that. And what Jesus is saying again, you changed religiously the code, if you will. You no longer, you're no longer honoring your parents, you're no longer taking care of them, and you've made something totally different. So, again, the point illustrated, I'm not at liberty to choose what is right and wrong morally. If I want to be involved in some sin, I can't say, well, it's all right for me. I leave my wife, I begin to see some other woman here, and well, my wife and I, we just didn't get along, and this woman was made for me, and I love her, and how could it be wrong if it feels so right? I can convince myself that I'm okay. Does that make it right? No, it doesn't. So it's, again, and that's the point. God never gave anyone the liberty to choose what is right and wrong. Choose meaning that I can make up my own way, whether it be of worship, whether it be of morality. Yeah, God never gave me that liberty. He has a standard, and I must follow that standard. All right, any thoughts or comments? We're going to look at another example or two here. Anything? In Matthew chapter 15, verse 9, a parallel passage to what we just read, Jesus says, but in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. And that's the issue. Even though I've already said it, let me just read from my notes. God never left issues of worship, moral codes, and the like to our own pleasures. Where in the Bible does God suggest that commandments of religious practices and patterns of righteousness be left to the opinions of men? Where does it teach we can do things the way we want or prefer? Well, we can't. And that's the whole point. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, I'll turn and read that to you, and then I'll ask you a question. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21, Paul wrote, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. How is that possible? Let me read it again. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. How can I do that? How can we do that? Can we?
Verse 22 says, abstain from every form of evil.
All right. Can I do that? I'm trying to help you see we can do that. We must do that. How? We have a standard to follow. Yes. So, again, as a new convert, I think we need to make sure that our new converts understand, and I'm not trying to rehearse everything we've already gone through the last two class periods about authority and the necessity of it. But that authority is not, I am not the authority. My opinion must change when I read and study this book. I have talked to people who had opinions, far out opinions on a lot of different things. But if they read the scriptures, those opinions must change. Because I must change my views and so on to fit this book, because this is the standard. I am the standard. You know, when we look back religiously, and I asked the elders when I talked to them about the class after they asked me to do this, before I became an elder, and I asked, how far back do you want me to talk about church history and so on? And they thought that was perhaps a little too much. But I'm a firm believer in helping people to realize that denominationalism is relatively new. I don't know how old the oldest person here is. I don't know if we have anyone in our 80s in our audience. Probably not this evening. Probably all in our 70s. But from the time that you were born, if your parents took you down the road, the moment your eyes could see any distance, there were denominations on every corner. More so today than then, but it was here. When I had an opportunity to preach at a tent meeting, West Jefferson, North Carolina, this past year, and it was right next to a campground, and there were a lot of visitors. I was impressed, really, by a lot of the visitors that came, and most of them was denominations, members of denominations, and mostly Baptists. And I was not unkind at all. But I said, if we go back, if we look 1,000 years after Jesus, not 500, imagine 1,000 years after Jesus. And I tried to walk them up mentally to think in that term. And I'm walking down the street 1,000 years after Jesus, and I see someone, and they ask me about religion. And if I were to say, I'm a member of the First Baptist Church here in town, what? If you were to say that to someone today, everyone would understand, oh, I know, that's the brick on the corner. But if you were to say, I'm a member of the First Baptist Church, or I'm a member of a Free Will Baptist Church, or a Southern Baptist Church, and they would look at you like, I don't know what you're talking about. Why is that?
Because there's just one church.
It didn't exist.
It didn't exist then.
And sometimes because we see it every day, and I don't care if it's the Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, etc., because we see it every day, we have this sad habit of just assuming it's always been that way. It's always been that way ever since I remember. I'm in my 60s, and as far back as I can remember it existed. The Baptist Church didn't come into existence until the year 1604, 1606, and I go on from that 1,000 years, and I said, do you realize 1,500 years, that's a long time, after Jesus, no one had ever heard of the Baptist Church. No one had ever heard of the Methodist Church. No one had ever heard of the Presbyterian Church. Now, these things were totally foreign. And I was trying to help the people say, let's just go back and be Christians. All those things are much too new, if you will, for the Bible. And anyway, the elders, they agreed to, not go back and look at it, because I was prepared to go back and just take us all the way through that time period. But I am bound to follow the Scriptures to find my authority for everything. How I worship, the moral code that I practice, everything must be a thus saith the Lord. All right, that's all I'll say about that, because we've looked at it now for 2.5 weeks. Any comments you might have on that?
Well, Dave, we changed one thing, you might as well change everything. Let's do what you want to do.
It's very true. And Butch, I liken that to Connie and I. One of the things we've been dabbling with back in the summer was catfishing. All right? And, I'm yet to catch one, but she's caught, two. The first one was a channel cat, wasn't that big. But she caught a big flathead, and she was holding it up here, and it was almost touching it. It was a monster of a cat, a monster of a flathead. But we were on this little, it was a bank, it come off, and then it really dropped off pretty quick. But we had an anchor thrown out to try to keep us there, because we were using suspended bait, we were using live bluegill. And, the wind would blow, the boat would come by, and before long I said, honey, weren't we closer to the shore earlier? Yeah, we were. And we were fishing some at night too. My point being, once you drift a little bit, where are you going to go? There's no stopping. Once you lift your anchor, you're going to go whichever way the wind blows. And when we take up our anchor out of biblical authority, as Butch said, if you change one thing, you just about change it all. It doesn't really matter. And you begin to drift. Church history, again. If you will look back, if you will, in the year 1900, 1901, the general census of churches recognized that there was a major split between the Church of Christ and Disciples of Christ. Later, the Disciples of Christ would choose the name of the title of Christian church. And it was over the instrument in the beginning, mechanical instruments, a piano. All right? But now I'll challenge you to see how far, when you take up that anchor out of biblical authority, and they said, well, it really doesn't matter. They had it in the Old Testament. How far, in general, they've drifted. I had a conversation with a young man. I was rekeying his house. He was a student at Milligan College. He was in their theology department. And if you don't know, Milligan College typically is associated with the Christian church. But he said something about, maybe he was talking to somebody on the phone. I couldn't help but overhear it. But he was talking about a woman that was preaching. And he invited this guy to come to hear her preach. And, I couldn't help it. So after he got through, I just kind of asked a vague question about, where he went and so on. And did they have an issue with a woman preaching publicly, I'm saying, to a mixed audience, as I am? He said, oh, no, we have an evening chapel. And I said, well, what about what Paul wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 2? And he said, oh, that's Paul Bain's epistle. He said, listen, if Paul would have known, if he would have had he called it the sociology, the society, if he would have understood how educated women would be today, if he had understood the abilities that women have, and all that's true. All of that is true. Many women are greater orators than men. In other words, command of the English language. So there's no problem there today. We have women that are just as educated as any man. All that he was right on. But his view of it, if Paul would have had this knowledge of how women had I don't mean progressed, but in our society at least, how they have been allowed to go to college. In the Middle East, under Islam, women, at least in some countries, Afghanistan being one of them, are not even allowed to go to school.
They can't even drive.
No, it's true. And if they're out in public, they've got to have a relative with them. They cannot allow to speak out in public, etc. And even in the Bible, the Old Testament, certainly women were to be veiled, etc., etc. My point being, what he was saying, well, that's why Paul said those things. And I disagree with him, because Paul says it's because of, it goes all the way back to creation. Nevertheless, the point being, what he was saying was, that's the reason Paul said those things. He was basically ignorant of how women would be today in this century. Therefore, sure, we allow it. You take your anchor up out of biblical authority, and then you drift. meaning, well, if that's okay, I'm going to change my view on this, that, and other. I don't have that right, you see. God has not given me the right. I don't have any problem against a woman. I'm married one. And in many ways, she's better than I am. She certainly helped me along in our 41 years of marriage. But does that mean she can preach?
No,
She doesn't know. I'm just kidding.
that's different.
No, I'm just kidding about that. So again, the point is, I must have biblical authority for all I say and do. And we need to make sure that new converts understand that when we take up that anchor out of biblical authority, we're going to be just anything. And I can't be. I've got to stay with that.
That kind of started too, when the women's rights and all that, because I remember when I was working, the men did certain jobs and then the women did certain jobs, but then and then when the rights come, the women's, want right to vote and do this and do that. And then they wanted the same wages as the men.
Yeah, they should. If they do the job.
And then that's if it was the same job
Sure.
of the man. But there were some things that some, women can't do when it comes to lifting and doing this and doing that, So it really, it's just something, how they look at that, like a woman. It's not necessarily, like you said, just because they're not bright or anything like that.
Yeah, right. Let me just read to you, since I brought it up, why. Look at what Paul says about when 1 Timothy chapter 2 about not preaching. He says, 1 Timothy 2 verse 11, let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. Why? He gives two reasons. For Adam was first born, then Eve. Does that have anything to do with the woman's ability? Does that have anything to do? No, it's just the roles are different. I will never bear a baby. I may look like it, but I'll never have a child. My wife will never father a child. We are made different. God, that's just the way He made man and woman. And then He goes on to say the second reason, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. He's talking about Adam and Eve there. So those are reasons which have nothing to do with the abilities, with the social limitations that was placed upon her in the culture back in the first century. But it's simply what the Bible teaches. Again, we're just made different, and so it is. Okay, we'll begin a new series, Organization of the Church. I think it's important, the new converts. I know this is not new knowledge to any of you, but we'll go over it anyway. Elders, bishops, pastors oversee and watch after the local congregation. All those terms, and we'll go in specifically later about the meaning of those titles, but they all have to do with the role of what we commonly just use one word, and that's the elders. I want to set the stage. We find that God is orderly in all that He does. God is a God of order. Look back at creation. When you first begin to read the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And then you have these details of how He created it. Do any of you believe that He created fish before water?
No.
What about plants and trees before light? No. And I know this is maybe it's kind of silly, but look at the order of His creation. Plants and trees and so on has to have light. Well, light existed before the trees. Fish would have to have water. Water existed before the fish. Everything that God created was in order. Have you ever thought about when Jesus fed the 5,000? Let me turn it, let's read that. Mark chapter 6, verse 35. I want to read that to you. And I want us to think about this, and we see the wisdom of Jesus and how he handled this occasion. And you see that his decisions help bring about order. Mark chapter 6, verse 35. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, This is a desert place, and now the time is past, is far past. Send them away, that they may go into this country round about, and into the villages, and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. And he answered and said unto them, Give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, Shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread, and give them to eat? And he said unto them, How many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they came, and when they knew, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, he blessed, brake the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish divided he among them all. They did all eat and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments and of the fish. Now here's my point. You have at least 5, the Bible says 5,000 men. That's a lot of people. They're all hungry. If I were to stand up here and say, okay, if y'all come, I've got bread and fish, what would happen? What would happen?
You wouldn't have none.
You didn't.
I'd be mobbed. But he doesn't do that. He has them first sit down in companies of 50s. And then he gave to his disciples and told the disciples, take the food to them. I mean, again, that would have been an orderly way of doing so, rather than everyone rush to the front to get the food, because in their mind, if I don't get up there soon, if I'm at the end of the line, there won't be any. And there would have been a horde of people coming. But Jesus, having the foresight, knew there had to be order. Now, later we're going to talk about this, and I'll draw this to conclusion as we talk about the elders, but there has to be order. God's not the author of confusion, but of order. All right, I appreciate you listening as we went through that. I know most all that is knowledge to you. I mean, it's a rehash, if you will, because you already know those things. But I think it's important for